Hello and welcome to this presentation on the social footprint of a packaging waste prevention campaign in Zamudio. My name is Ivan Muñoz and I work for 20 LCA Consultants in Denmark. In this presentation, I will first introduce you to the concept of the social footprint, and then I will describe this waste prevention campaign conducted in Zamudio and how we applied the social footprint method to this particular case study. The social footprint can be understood as a streamlined method for social LCA, and it is defined as the equity-weighted share of the well-being and productivity impact that can be assigned to a product or service. It constitutes a measure of all social, environmental, and economic externalities, measured with a top-down approach. It requires low amounts of data, and it applies a monetary valuation of those impacts. Given a production system, the social footprint aims to measure how this system impacts society's well-being in monetary terms. Now, with LCA, what we do is to evaluate environmental impacts, which we can monetize and constitute a fraction of the total impacts. But besides environmental impacts, we also have other externalities, let's say due to lack of education, corruption, etc. And these also need to be included. So all of these externalities is what we call the productivity impact. But also through production and consumption, we also induce positive effects on well-being, since we are inducing monetary transactions between different groups in society. So that's a literal redistribution of wealth. And this is what we call the income redistribution. And in the end, the social footprint is the difference between the productivity impact and the income redistribution. Now let's introduce the two components of the social footprint with a little more detail. First of all, we have the income redistribution, which is calculated as the life cycle cost of an activity once adjusted for purchase power and equity weighting. By equity weighting, we mean the inclusion of the economic concept of utility, meaning the level of satisfaction from consuming a certain product or service. So typically, this utility decreases as income increases, which is what you see in this figure in the bottom right of the slide. The slope of the utility curve corresponds to the elasticity of marginal utility. Now, if we use as an example the expenditure of €1 in production of clothing in France and in India, we see that the equity-weighted value added is much higher in India than in France due to the higher marginal utility in India. So spending one additional euro in India produces higher utility than the same amount of money in France. And then we have the productivity impact, which is calculated as the so-called productivity gap, once adjusted again by purchase power and equity weighting. We have already talked about equity weighting, so here we are going to focus on this productivity gap. And this is defined as the gap or difference for a given country between its current GDP and the potential GDP in an ideal world without externalities. Now, to establish this potential GDP, the social footprint takes the United States economy as a reference. But of course, the US economy also suffers from externalities, and therefore we need to correct it. In 2016, the GDP per capita in the US was $57,600, and on top of this value, we add an estimated loss of production due to different kinds of externalities or activities such as domestic work that are not accounted for as part of GDP. So with this estimate, we get that the GDP in an ideal economy without externalities in any country in the world could reach 115,000 US dollars. Now the difference between this value and the actual GDP in a given country is what is taken in the social footprint as the productivity gap. And once we have a country-specific productivity impact, what we do is to distribute this value over the industries or economic sectors of the country in proportion to the value added of each sector, each economic sector, and then we apply utility weighting. Here you have an example of the productivity impact for milk production in Sweden and in India. You have the productivity impact once corrected for purchase power, and you can see that the productivity impact is higher in India because the gap between the ideal GDP and the actual GDP is much higher in India than in Sweden. But then once we apply equity weighting, this difference, this gap, is substantially increased because of the marginal utility. Because in India, the marginal utility is much higher than in Sweden. Okay, so now we're going to briefly describe the case study, which is this packaging waste prevention campaign in Zamudio. Zamudio is a small town in the north of Spain, in the region of Euskadi. It has around 3,200 inhabitants, and this campaign was conducted as part of a EU project. The goal of the campaign was to reduce the amount of single-use packaging and food wrappers used by citizens when they go shopping for meat, vegetables, and fish. In short, the campaign consisted on the distribution for free of reusable shopping containers and bags to the citizens in Zamudio, so they could collect these materials for free in the town hall. And this campaign lasted for 7 months, from 2018 to 2019, and the level of participation was surveyed through online surveys, phone, and also personal interviews. But also the local shops were involved, taking records, as in how many customers would either use single-use packaging or reusable packaging and containers when they came to the shops. In the end, it was estimated that around 37% of Zamudio's households participated in the campaign. In order to apply the social footprint method to this case study, we considered 2 scenarios. One that we call a business as usual, which reflects the shopping habits before the campaign. And then we have a campaign scenario, which reflects the changes in habits according to the surveys, but extrapolated to a hypothetical situation where 100% of the population, and not only 37%, would take part in the prevention campaign. And then the functional unit to compare the 2 scenarios is the provision of the affected packaging materials in Zamudio for 1 year. In this diagram, you have the activities included in the foreground system for the business as usual scenario. Essentially, it is the life cycle of the packaging materials affected by the campaign. And in the campaign scenario, we have the same, but on top of the existing materials, we add the reusable packaging and the eventual washing of the reusable containers and bags. The study was conducted with primary data coming from the surveys in terms of the amount of packaging used by citizens in the 2 scenarios. As you can see in the table, the total amount is substantially reduced in the campaign scenario. We also took into account the status of local packaging waste recycling and disposal, and then we took some assumptions in terms of, for example, how often would the citizens wash the reusable containers and bags. All the primary data were linked in the background to the Exaiobase version 3.3.16. This is an input-output database with data for 43 countries plus 5 rest of the world regions. Each country has 164 sectors, and then we have extended this database by adding income redistribution and productivity impact values in each dataset in the database, as you see here, as implemented in CIMA Pro. And with this, we jump to the results. In the table, you have the social footprint in million euro utility weighted. You can see that the social footprint for the campaign is a little lower, around 14%. With Exaiobase, we can also see that the life cycle cost of the campaign is a little higher, which means we will have a rebound effect. This is taken into account in the study as a rebound effect, which means there is a little less disposable income in the pockets of the citizens in the campaign scenario, and this means they can consume less products and services. In this graph, we have a difference analysis, which tells us what is the net change when moving from the business as usual to the campaign scenario. And what we see is that we have more social footprint from the activities or the supply chains associated to dishwashing and hand washing of reusable containers and bags. Some more impact also from plastic recycling, but at the same time we have a beneficial effect or credit from the avoidance of single-use food packaging, especially plastics and also some paper. Then what we can do with Exaiobase is to conduct a deeper contribution analysis in order to understand which activities and in which places of the world these social impacts are taking place. So if we look at the avoided activities that are giving us a social benefit, we see that they are mainly taking place in China, in India, such as plastics production, chemicals production. And if we look instead at those activities that have an increased impact, social impact, in the campaign scenario, we see that they take place mainly in the rest of the world region of Asia and in Spain. Many of these activities are related to the manufacture of the dishwashing equipment. So, to conclude, we see that this campaign leads to a social benefit of around 14% according to the social footprint. This is related to the avoidance of plastic supply chains mainly. There is an increase in social impacts associated to the increased use of dishwashing, especially related to the manufacture of the dishwasher. And on the method, we see that the social footprint, when combined with a tool like Exaiobase, provides a very powerful method for quantitative life cycle based social screening. That's it from my side. If you would like to have more information about the social footprint, please check out our website and our social LCA club. Thank you and have a good day.